Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. The outcome of the 2024 Taiwan presidential election has the potential to reshape the Taiwan Strait and the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region. With the presidential debate between Taiwan's three candidates just around the corner, we'll get to grips in this show with some of the hot-button issues. Joining us today are Chong Ja Ian, National University of Singapore Associate Professor of Political Science and Carnegie China's non-resident scholar, and Raymond Sung, Prospect Foundation Vice President, and Amanda Hsiao, International Crisis Group Senior Analyst for China. A very warm welcome, everyone, to the show today. Professor Chong, let me come to you first. So, according to some public surveys, the economy is actually the issue that most Taiwanese say is the biggest issue. So how far would you say China itself is a factor in the economic policy proposals by each candidate?
So I think all three candidates can't get away from the fact that China remains Taiwan's largest trading partner in goods. However, the approach is slightly different. So essentially for the TPP and for the KMT, they focus a little bit more on integration, whereas the DPP focuses a little bit more on diversification, on being less perhaps dependent on the Chinese economy. But on the economic issues, it's not all just trade. I think over the past 8 years, Taiwan's economy has grown, but the big issue has to do with wage growth, has to do with income inequality, in addition to just GDP growth. It's whether the goods, the benefits of the GDP growth gets distributed across society.
Okay, so let us deal with perhaps some of the political attacks, Raymond. So there is criticism of the ruling party. However, Hsiao Kim, the vice presidential candidate for the DPP, has said that the KMT has put all its eggs into the China basket.
I think that's the controversial point about KMT's allegation that that Taiwan should go back to getting a closer relationship with the mainland China, especially in terms of trade, no matter in trading goods or trading services. And they want to resuscitate the failed pact of service trade failed in 2014. But on the other side, the DPP has the deliberate policy, for example, in terms of a new southbound policy to getting a closer relationship with ASEAN countries and India, for example. And due to, for the past several years changes, we see that actually the picture has also already shifted. For example, in terms of trading goods that Taiwan used to export about more than 40% of goods to the Chinese market. But we see that figure has been decreasing, especially in 2022 and 2023. So the current figure might be low to the 35%. In terms of investment, it's also a very, very large gap. For example, back to 2012, Taiwan's foreign direct investment to China is taken about 80% of Taiwan's FDI, but now it's about just a little more than 30%. But on the other hand, Taiwan's direct investment to ASEAN country now is about 35% last year. It's the first time that surpasses that Taiwan's investment to China.
Amanda, is diversification the DPP way the answer? Or, as Professor had mentioned, the TPP and the KMT are seeking more integration with China. But he also mentioned, of course, the income gap, the distribution of that wealth.
Sure. I think diversification is actually a theme that all of the candidates are pointing to. It's their version of diversification is perhaps a little different. So,
could you help us outline?
Yeah, sure. As was mentioned, the DPP's claim to diversification is through the new southbound policy to move away from China. The KMT's claim is that we need to actually diversify into China a bit more. And so we hear from Ho that he says that he will restart negotiations on ECFA, the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, and maybe eventually the Cross-strait Services Trade Agreement, which of course saw a lot of protests in 2014 in response when the KMT was in power. So I think both sides are claiming to diversify, and so that's quite interesting. And as for the TPP, I think the difference there is that Ke has been saying that instead of CPTPP, he's saying that why not join the RCEP, which for him is actually the pathway is to alleviate tensions with China first as well before joining RCEP. So we see that there's a bit of a difference in emphasis in terms of what the KMT and the TPP are saying, which is that the pathway perhaps lies through China, and DPP is saying it doesn't.
Ian, you mentioned the integration, and Amanda has outlined some of that. To the voters, is diversification into China real diversification?
So I guess the consideration would be how much you think growth is important, and I guess the argument for diversification or integration directly into China as per the KMT, or into China together with other regional economies as per the TPP. That rests on a view that integration with China would get you faster growth. It would also it also rests on this view that China continues to have a lot of potential given the shape of the Chinese economy. That assumption, I think, can be challenged. Now, on the DPP side, the view is that perhaps maybe even integration into China would get you faster growth. However, it's riskier. And
on a political level?
On both a political and an economic level. So that sort of, I think, understands the fact that the PRC economy itself is not growing as fast, and perhaps you need to look for other opportunities. That's actually in line, I think, with a lot of what other developed economies have been doing. We talked about the diversification of supply chains.
De-risking.
De-risking. So it's the DPP approach is actually not that different from what South Korea, Japan, the European Union, the US are doing.
Let's talk about China itself. It looms large, obviously, in this election, as it has with many others. Let's take a look at what each candidate says about their cross-strait policy. And this was at a recent policy presentation. In order of the ballot number.
我的主张是台湾自主、两岸和平。台湾自主就是在维持现在我们享有的民主自由的政治制度跟生活方式之下，我们愿意以对等、尊严的方式和大陆展开交流。
我将落实和平四大支柱行动方案，强化全民保家卫国的意识，强化国防，强化经济，以及强化和民主阵营的合作。
我提出的是一个3D 战略，遏止、对话、降低冲突风险，让咱台湾的自我防卫能力让提升，备战不迎战。
So just to summarise each candidate's cross-strait policies in order of ballot voting number, take a look at this graphic. Chong Ja of the Taiwan People's Party advocates for Taiwan, he calls Taiwan's autonomy and cross-strait peace. Lai Ching-te of the Democratic Progressive Party proposes his 4-pillar plan for peace. And Ho Yo-i has, of course, the 3 Ds, deterrence, dialogue, and de-escalation. Amanda, if I can ask you, in this debate and generally, how does each candidate position their party in relation to China?
Sure. So each is really claiming that they have the best strategy for preserving peace for Taiwan. And the key difference is really the extent to which each emphasizes China's role in securing Taiwan. So for Lai, what he is really, and what the DPP is saying, is they're calling for what they call a dignified peace, in which China is really not the key pathway towards preserving Taiwan's security. Rather, it's not depending on China, which, as they say, is unreliable and threatening. Really, it's about strengthening ourselves and believing in Taiwan. So, the emphasis is really on defense, but also deepening Taiwan's international relations, particularly with like-minded democratic countries. For the KMT, for Ho, the pathway there is very much still through China. So the KMT's agenda remains focused on resuming dialogue with China via the 1992 consensus. But Ho does add that, if he were president, that he would also strengthen Taiwan's defense, which is something we can get into a bit later. And so he's saying that if Taiwan resumes low and stable dialogue, this is the pathway to alleviating tensions. And then as for Ke, he's really trying to position himself in between the two sides. So he's saying if you choose green, it's war. If you choose blue, it's surrender. Okay, so he's claiming that his approach would be friendlier to China than the current approach, but that it wouldn't come at the cost of Taiwan's sovereignty and interests, which there he's alleging that the KMT would be inclined to do that, but he would also not demonize China, which is he's saying the DPP is doing. So for him, cross-strait dialogue is important, he says, to manage risk, but again, defense is a key a piece of his strategy as well.
Professor, so this seems like a very persuasive argument, no?
So actually, from my perspective, the starting points of all three candidates are actually quite similar. So in some way, shape or form, they will stress Taiwan's democratic system, that they want to preserve it. So that's the status quo bit. And then they talk about defense and deterrence. I suppose that's a reasonable sort of view to when you look at a PRC that's much stronger, that is making a lot of threatening moves. So on those fronts, I think...
And that includes a change in the KMT's position.
So I think the KMT talks about deterrence as well. So Ho talks about deterrence as well.
I mean historic or traditionally.
So it depends on how far back in history you go. So I think where there is a bit of a difference is for the Ke side and the Ho side, they emphasize dialogue a little bit more. So they believe that there is something to be gained from speaking with the PRC, with Beijing, whereas I think the DPP has a more skeptical view of that. I suppose a lot of this comes down on really a matter of trust. How much trust the different parties have in Beijing? How much trust do they have in Beijing's ability to commit to restraint? And I suppose the DPP's position is one that if we look at Beijing's position on Hong Kong, whether it's the Sino-British Joint Declaration or the Basic Law, if you look at Beijing's position on the South China Sea, its promises in actually a treaty to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, Beijing have reneged on all these. So dialogue, exchanges, fine, but they probably don't expect Beijing to hold to any promises. Whereas I suppose on the TPP side and the KMT side, they probably expect that Beijing might actually keep to some commitments that they make. But this is really projecting into the future, so we really don't know.
Raymond, what does the DPP think about dialogue?
Right. I think that's going to a weak point of the KMT argument, because it never says about what's the reason of the breakdown of the dialogue between Taiwan and China back in 2016 when Tsai Ing-wen took office. Actually, that was a deliberate policy pushed by Xi Jinping, and by that pushing more pressures on Taiwan and to try to corner Taiwan and try to suppress Taiwan into getting a political dialogue with it and trying to get a submission from Taiwan. Actually, back to August 2022, when Nancy Pelosi was visiting Taiwan, the vice chairman of KMT paid a visit to Beijing to talk to the Chinese Communist Party, and the dialogue, the content, what did they talk, and how did they talk about it, and the records has never been revealed to the public. So it's not satisfactory to a Taiwanese voter to say that, simply alleging that because you are get better relations, better trust from the Chinese side, and you are being capable of dealing with China. And for example, for the blue-white convergence, there's a terrible talk between the two parties. And when the two parties seem after that failure, total failure, open failure of that, they come back to the Taiwanese voters say, we are very capable of engaging in talk, not only between us, but to the Chinese party, which is not credible at all.
Amanda, your view about the KMT's ability to dialogue with China, of course, the basis of that is the 1992 consensus, and this is, as Raymond mentioned, an agreement that the DPP does not commit to, does not agree to that, although it agrees to the spirit of the talks itself that occurred in 1992. Hsiao Kim recently called the consensus outdated. She also said, how can Taiwan move forward by advocating proposals from 3 decades ago? what's your view on this consensus? How important is it becoming in this election?
So it's definitely coming up in this elections. Just to give a little bit of context on the 1992 consensus, I think we saw that the political market in Taiwan for this consensus has really shrunk. And perhaps we could mark it to January 1st, 2019, when Xi Jinping gave a very large speech, an important one on the cross-strait relationship and how he sees it. And I think that speech, the tone of it, the substance of it, in which he gave a definition of the 92 consensus, but also in the same speech spoke about the Taiwan sort of model of one country, two systems. It left a certain impression, I think, amongst Taiwanese viewers on both sides, whether you were KMT or DPP, that things have changed under Xi Jinping in terms of the cross-strait approach. And there were a lot of questions as to whether the 92 consensus in Xi Jinping's mind was linked to one country, two systems. And since then, I think it's become a politically riskier proposition to make in Taiwan that is just, I think, less persuasive for a lot of voters. And the KMT is well aware of this. We see that Ho, when he talks about the 1992 consensus, he caveats it by saying that it is in accordance with Taiwan's own constitution. Okay, and there, what he's trying to signal to voters is that, in fact, the KMT still believes that there is enough ambiguity in the 92 consensus to allow for the ROC sovereignty, and that the Constitution permits it as well. But of course, for the DPP, the fact of Xi Jinping's speech in 2019, but also the fact that Beijing has never explicitly recognized that there are multiple interpretations inherent to the 1992 consensus, right? They have never actually said what the KMT claims it is. I think for the DPP, it's too risky of a proposition, and that accepting it would harm Taiwan's interest in sovereignty.
Professor Chong, can we conflate these two concepts, 1992 consensus and one country, two systems, given that China is significantly larger, more powerful, its military many times more powerful than Taiwan's?
So basically, the question comes down to, should there be an agreement on the 92 consensus, whatever it means, if Beijing decides to reinterpret it, if Beijing decides to change its mind, what can anyone do? What can any party in office in Taiwan do? I mean, just to sort of go back to a point that Amanda had made, when the meetings in '92 occurred, and when in 2000, when Suu Kyi had came up with the term, the KMT's position was that there's one China, multiple interpretations. Beijing has never acknowledged that. Beijing has never said that they, accepted it. They made no mention of it. They just say it's one China. And so there's that gap in the view. I mean, yes, I get it's fudging, it's agreeing to disagree, but that gap means to say that Beijing has a lot of leeway to reinterpret. And should a party agree to 92 consensus, and Beijing says no, that's not what we mean, then the party that accepts it on Taiwan will then have to say no, we mean something else. Beijing will then come back and say, well, you've reneged from what you've agreed is not our understanding, and then they will be on the defensive again. So I think that vagueness with the 92 consensus, and the fact that in Xi's mind, he's linked 92 consensus apparently with one country, two systems, creates an added complication in taking it on as a formula.
So you're saying that there is danger in Taiwan for doing that? That's
right. So I mean, on Taiwan's side, basically, there's nothing that can be done if Beijing decides to renege, right? And then when they do so, a common tactic will be to say that, well, the Taiwan side has changed, and Taiwan will be on the defensive again.
Now, on that point, something that China has done, and your research had come to that conclusion. That is that China claimed that 181 countries, this is the wording, have established diplomatic relations with China on the basis of the One China principle since the founding in 1949 of the PRC, and that the China principle is a universal consensus of the international community. your research found that only 51 actually recognized that principle.
So the One China principle, which broadly states that there's one China in the world, Taiwan's part of China, and the sole legal government of China is the PRC. Now, when countries establish ties with the PRC, they tend to sort of, have their own position. They have their own interests and ties with Taiwan. They want to figure out how they want to manage relations with Beijing. And so there's a variety of formulas they use. The most well-known one is the US one, where they acknowledge that Chinese on both sides of the strait say that it's one China. They do not challenge that position. But that acknowledgement is not acceptance, it's not recognition. And other states have varying, so I think Australia used they note. In that respect, I think what the PRC is trying to do is to, I think, shift the popular understanding towards a position that they prefer. Now, that's what lies behind this sort of recent slew of statements. Whereas I think for other states, there may be good reason for why they had their one China policies that differ from the principle. But as time goes on, sometimes politicians and bureaucrats, they forget. And that sort of lack of memory, lack of historical memory allows room for fudging and for the PRC to shift things in their direction. And
so similar to what you believe could happen with the 1992 consensus.
Right. So I mean, Beijing has a sort of record with this. I gave some examples earlier. Another one is the UN Resolution 2758, which Beijing claims recognizes Taiwan as part of China. But if you actually look at the text, it does not even mention Taiwan at all. It talks about the representative seat of China going to the PRC and the expulsion of Chiang Kai-shek's representatives. It doesn't mention Taiwan.
Okay, Raymond, let's have a look at what diplomatic challenges we've seen. Sort of the condition or the situation of Taiwan over the past sort of 50 years since One China principle came about. What sort of further pressure do you think that Taiwan's next president could come under? Diplomatic challenges.
I think Ian has also already given us an excellent account about what the One China principle or policy has developed. I think the international community interest has been aligned with the line that the peaceful existence of Taiwan separate from China and the status quo of the free and open Taiwan Strait and the independence governance of Taiwan out of China. That's be in accordance with the international community's interest. And so we see that G7 summit, no matter in the head of states or the foreign minister, some declaration statements say that they strongly oppose any unilateral attempt to use force to change the status quo. That's not in accordance to the international community interests. They are not to the majority of the big major countries of the world's interest, and it's not to the interest of Taiwanese people, because any changes of Taiwan status need to be done only by the assent and active consent of the Taiwanese people and no one else. So, and of course, all the three candidates said they've been striving to maintain this, the way of life of the Taiwanese people currently, which means that they don't want to see Taiwan being governed by China, and they oppose the use of force by China against Taiwan.
Okay, so Amanda, moving from the relationship with China that Raymond laid out there now to the US. Of course, the US-China rivalry is the backdrop to this elections. How do you think the interactions of the three parties, Taiwan with the US, could affect the outcome of this election?
Yeah, so, so far Washington, and I expect this to remain the case, Washington has really been careful about maintaining a position of neutrality. It's making clear that it has no desire to wade in on these elections, and that its policy towards Taiwan will remain unchanged, regardless of who is elected on January 13th. And so the US has been very studiously careful in the last couple of months. But of course, on China's part, on the other hand, it's made very clear its preference for either the KMT or the TPP over the DPP, and it's enacted a series of political, military, and economic measures to try to make its argument clearer to Taiwanese voters. Its narrative that a vote for the DPP is a vote for war and decline, and a vote for the others will be a vote for peace and prosperity. And so, just last week we saw that China has enacted a partial suspension of ECFA to really make clear, loud and clear, this morning that more economic pain could follow if the vote is an outcome that it dislikes. So I think that the two major powers are certain there in the background of these elections. The U.S. is standing back, but China is really leaning in right now.
Would you call it election interference?
Sure, that's definitely an attempt at election interference. However, the effect is another thing. I think since 1996, China has tried to interfere in Taiwan's elections. And so on the one hand, Taiwanese voters are smart and they're quite sensitive to these attempts. And so any attempts that are too overt or too heavy-handed will actually create potentially a backlash effect in Taiwan. And I think Beijing is clearer about that now. And so its attempts to interfere might not quite have the effect that it seeks.
Okay, well, we're going to have to end it there. Professor Ian Chong and Raymond Sung and Amanda Hsiao, thank you so much for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.